All right, welcome everybody to this tour of gexbot.com. I'm super happy to have Jasper here with me to give you guys insight into everything that we're displaying, right? Like this is mainly a data visualization company. We want you guys to know exactly what the data is that you're seeing. So yeah, without further ado, Jasper, what are we looking at right now? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, John. I'm excited to go over all our old features that we've revamped and all the new stuff that we've built over the past year or so.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting, and I think we'll ramp it up as we go through this video, right? We're going to start with the old stuff, and then it'll get a little more complicated, but also a little more interesting as we go through. So, for people that don't know, what is it that we're looking at when we see, for instance, like one of these two different green bars, and then let's look at the two different types of red bars. So let's just start with this like a really bright green one over here, for instance. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, so these bars are showing our GEX or gamma exposure by strike, and our brighter ones are GEX by volume, meaning it's looking at the GEX of the volume of contracts that have traded. And then the darker bars are our GEX by OI or GEX by open interest, which is just measuring the GEX of the open interest at each strike.
Yeah, okay. And then it also seems like when I'm looking at one of these, there's also all these like really cool dots. As I hover over them, I can kind of see, but it looks like 10-minute prior, 1 minute prior, 15, 30. How are these calculated, and like how would you go about using or seeing them? What do they mean?
Yeah, so when we're looking at the bars, we're really just looking at the current state. And so in order to get an idea of the change across time, we added these dots where it's just telling you, 5, 15, 30 minutes ago, what was the level of GEX at that strike for that time frame.
Gotcha. So if the dot is like really far outside of the histogram, like maybe over here, these like 4350s, you can see that I guess the gamma exposure there has
Yes.
been shrinking. Whereas if the dot is inside the strike, you can see that the gamma exposure there has been growing, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Cool. And then in addition to that, I kind of wanted to mention, right, like the a big part of the challenge in designing a lot of these tools has been the time component, because whenever you look at Gex charts, almost anywhere, like any of the services that are out there, that have done a lot to popularize this stuff, a lot of it's static, which means that that time dimension, how things are changing over time, which is the main thing that we're thinking about when we're looking at price action, right? Just isn't included. So between the dots, and this is, you'll notice this is kind of a segue. Um, how does how does this history slider work? Why is it important? I'm talking about this thing. You can pop it out, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. So our history slider is effectively of rewinding time. So over the course of the day, as our state is being populated, if you want to review, say, like maybe the open, or if you just loaded onto the site, you wanted to see what was the past 30 minutes look like. Beyond just having the dots, you can then also pull our slider back and review the change in the structure and see where people were coming into how they are positioned currently.
Yeah, and I mean, hopefully we speak for everybody, for most traders out there when we say that being able to review price action, and even honestly just to learn how to use these tools, I feel like having the slider there to be able to scrub through and say, okay, this is how the day developed, right? Is just super helpful, especially with something like Gex, where um, it's really it takes a little bit of time. There's a little bit of a how would you put it? There's a little bit of an entry, a barrier to entry before you really get to a point where you feel like you really understand and get the hang for it.
Yeah, there's a learning curve to it for sure because it's not really a traditional way of looking at option structure. And there is that initial barrier, but I also feel like to a certain point there's sort of an intuition that comes. It's very similar to watching like footprint charts or order flow, right? Where you can get the feel of, or watching tape, where at first it's a little bit hard to understand, but you kind of get a sense of how buyers or sellers are behaving. And in that same sense, there's also that or that similar understanding that can develop with gex and how it morphs, how the feedback loop occurs between spot price moving through these positions and positions reacting to spot price, the reflexivity of it.
Yeah, and in that sense, even just having the history slider, like it's something that we put a lot of thought and effort into, just because it can uh, make your learning that much faster, right? If
Yes.
instead of having to spend hours and hours of screen time, you can literally just show up at the end of the day, slide through the day, and be like, "Oh, what happened today? What were the relevant levels? How did everything work?" It's just it's honestly a very powerful tool, and I'm emphasizing this because I feel like um, more people should do that. I've been doing it myself a lot, actually. But I should move
Ye-
on.
Yeah, I mean, I
Let's,
think reviewing trades is very important. This is a big step towards reviewing how these interact too.
yeah, and we'll get into it more too in the tools that follow
Hmm.
this. Before we move on, though, I wanted to go over basically all the levels that we have here on the right panel, between from zero gamma to max change, all these things. You want to do the volume ones, and maybe I'll do the open interest ones.
Yeah, sure. So our majors and zero, or let's see. So major positive, and that's marked in our dashboard. And it's also charted on the plot itself. That green line, that's just indicating the price at which option holders or call option holders or their positions will undergo max convexity. And for major negative, it's the same for put holders. And then zero gamma is our neutral point between between the two.
Yeah, and then in terms of the open interest levels, it's the same idea, right? Major positive is also that the correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just the call strike with the most concentration of gamma
Hmm.
at that point in time,
Yes,
right? And then
exactly.
the major negative is the put strike with the highest concentration, um, except that in this case we're taking open interest as our sort of the basis for that calculation. Um, the
Yes.
volume ones intraday have a tendency to be a lot more useful, obviously, because volume's live. Open interest got reported at the beginning of the day and then didn't change as much anymore. But then moving into netgex on both of them, both volume and open interest, is basically taking the state of the entire chain, right? So if we were going to sum up assuming that puts are negative gamma and calls are positive gamma, if we were to take and sum everything up into one calculation, we have netgex. And we have a lot of sort of traders that use that as a heuristic to sort of understand what regime we're in, and how much options are playing a role in overall price action. So we're not going to get into that a ton here, but that's generally what it means. The max change gex, I feel like, are kind of underrated and are pretty cool. Uh, just to have those
Yeah.
there on the side.
Yeah. So our max change x is also another way of looking at the change across time. So it's basically telling you for each of those time frames, which strike underwent the greatest change in gex. So it's a uh, more systematic look at what strikes are getting hit the most, or whose positions are growing the most. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, right? In general, we try to lean more into the visuals because we're trying to create something that for intraday trading that you can look at and you know what's going on. You don't have to think about it too much, right? That's the idea here. Um, but for people who do prefer something a little bit more systematic, like they're right, like the numbers are there, right? If you look for them, if you hover over, you can find your numbers, and you guys will see that as we move into the next packages. One thing I want to mention before we move on is that even gexbot Classic has multiple tickers. These are the tickers offered right now, and this will be carry over through the other packages, right? SPX, SPY, QQQ, Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, Amazon, NVIDIA. It's likely that it's basically certain that we're going to continue adding tickers. We're just trying to prioritize tickers that have high options volumes in which options control a lot of the flows, because we want this information to be as actionable as possible. Just also quickly before we move on, there's a pretty significant distinction here between full and next. Jasper, that full does the 3 months of expiries right now, or does this do the entire chain?
Yeah, so full does 3 months aggregated gex. So we look out, and then within the next 3 months, we sum the gex across those strikes. And then next is just looking at only the next expiry. And so for SPX, we have daily 0 TTs. I'm sure everyone's aware of that by now. But for other tickers, they might not have 0 TTs. So we're just looking at the nearest expiration. And that's why we call it next as opposed to 0 day.
And then, for instance, like for Apple or Tesla or whatever, it's quite likely that that's always going to be at most, what would that be, like 2 days away because it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday every week anyway, right?
Yeah, generally, yeah.
Until they add 0 DTs on those too, huh?
God, we'll see.
Then we'll support that too. All right, I think we're ready to move on to state, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this is our next package, and it's the state package. And the easiest way to begin explaining this, because it is a whole different ballgame, is to begin with the options profile. And actually, let me load history here so that we can show people exactly what we're talking about. But I'm going to get into this a little bit because this is sort of our baby in a way. We are very, very fanatical about order flow classification. And what we mean by order flow classification is we want to know whether when an options order comes in, whether it's a buy or a sell, right? Who is the aggressor in that transaction? And so you can get into the documentation more if you're interested in this, but basically we use a volatility surface model to kind of replicate the way that market makers think about the market and classify orders as they come in. And we're talking about like we're looking at a live feed that like it's coming in, updated every millisecond, and we're doing this on the fly, which is what's really, really cool about this. And the way that we've chosen to display all this stuff is that bars extending to the right mean customer buys, and bars extending to the left mean customer sells. And so unlike a typical GEX chart, right, where in the classic one, where there's this assumption of calls being positive gamma and puts being negative gamma, we can actually distinguish whether on the day, net, there have been more buys or sells at that particular strike for that particular contract. So in this particular case, right, like and actually for all these charts, I should mention you can change the colors. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. But just for the purposes of explaining this, and with the default colors, purple is puts and orange or this lighter color, those are the calls. And so here, for instance, at 44.35, you can see that there's a lot of short calls. Here at 4,300, you can see that there are a lot of long puts. And this is basically a way to get a sense live for how people are positioning themselves all the way across the chain. I kind of like to describe it, and maybe you'll have a better description of this, Jasper, but I kind of think about it as our landscape for the day, how everybody is getting set up in the world of options.
Yeah, it's a topological map, right, of like where people are actually positioned. One thing I want to note too is that with this classification model, the reason we implemented it, or part of the reason really, is that so for our classic gexbot, we're making the assumption where all puts are bought and all calls are sold, and therefore there's the naive gex still works generally well, but this is really something that's only true for SPX due to the nature of the agents who are actually trading SPX. Now, for individual equities, generally that assumption does not hold. And so making an assumption like that can really distort what the actual landscape looks like. Of course, we're applying this classification to SPX as well. So generally, we have found that assumption to hold, but this is a way of really pinning down exactly how people are positioned.
And the way that I like to think about it and explain it to people is that if you're looking at naive, right, classic gex by volume, high volume options nodes are still going to be very effective in terms of giving you good levels to trade off of. It's not that, right? Like that isn't the issue. The issue is how well does the gex model actually apply in terms of determining market direction, and whether, we have seen on occasion, less often, but sometimes there are nodes that seem really relevant in terms of classic gex that actually all those orders are matched, meaning that even though there's a lot of volume, that level isn't necessarily super important because there is no disagreement about that level. Everyone is very happy to transact there, and it's sort of just how would I put it? Uh, there's no outsized influence there because everything's just getting carried over quite nicely. That's more for sort of like a trading video. While I'm on that tangent, I'll also mention, for instance, right, like here we've been selling off today, and you can see that there's a ton of 43, 45 short calls, around 6,000, 7,000 of them, according to our classification system right now. That makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of call selling on SPX typically if we sell off, because it's just it's a pretty profitable way to trade the index. So as you get more screen time with this stuff, you start to notice more things like this, how people trade options. And I think it was a pretty big deal for us too when we first made this and we started to kind of see what was underneath the classic gex model, so to speak, like what was actually going on in terms of how the patterns that we had noticed prior were actually being formed, sort of with a little more granularity.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things was like seeing stuff come in. Um, it's just like way more clear in terms of where the actual imbalances are. Because it's the market, right? There's a lot of noise, and so generally it's about making this is about cutting away the noise and looking where people are actually located. Um,
Yeah. So here to reiterate, right, we're as the day goes on, we are categorizing orders, like basically looking at time and sales, categorizing orders as either buys or sells, and then netting it out. So if I look at the strike, I can say that net there were 4,000 more buys so far today of the 4,300 put than there were sells. It's pretty simple. Obviously, reading this, there's a lot of subtlety involved. We still have the dots, we still have the replay, all that stuff. Um, in fact, that's
y-
one of my favorite things is to go back and see how people were getting positioned over the course of the day.
yeah, one important thing to note is that so for gex or our gex profile, for classic as well as the state package, we have both the full and next expiries. But for the option profile or the volume distribution, we're only ever looking at either 0 TT or the next expiry. This is to really hone in the time frame that we're looking at. So we're only concerned with the intraday basis. For future updates or features, we'll probably add, further expiries in terms of looking at classified volume. But for now, it's just near term only.
Yeah, no, thanks. I totally forgot to
Mm-hmm.
mention that. And then I guess now moving on to next.
Mm-hmm.
This is uh, this is also only, as with option profile, only looking at the next expiry, as we discussed before, except here what we're doing is a little bit different because we're taking all of the what we like to call unmatched inventory or calls, and they're all getting displayed in green and to the right, and all puts are getting displayed in red and to the left, and in terms of their gamma exposure. So um, the reason for doing this is, well, number one, it carries over very nicely from Classic, because if you're used to reading that, then you'll have an easier time reading this. The other reason is what we're looking for here are really more so liquidity zones. And so we don't necessarily care whether, it's a customer or dealer position in particular. We just care that there is open inventory there. Um, and that is a significant level. And in practice, it actually, and this has been really, really cool to see, it actually reads very similar to to a gex chart. So for instance, the fact that we have all of these calls up here is like, well, actually, maybe I shouldn't get too deep into that. But yeah, is anything you want to add, Jesper?
Um, yeah, I mean, I still wanted to kind of get into that, right? Like, yes, on our classified volume, all those calls are short. And then, but then here, what is it? Positive gex we're looking at, but really it's we're looking at call gex, right? But the actual functions of whether those calls were long or short, or the effect it has when spot is trying to push through it, is very similar to classic gex, right? So we have this wall where it's sort of a cap, and it's not about whether someone's long or short there, but rather this is essentially putting a bit of a lid. This is something that if we want to, rally, or we're kind of doing a bit of a V, but if we wanted to actually squeeze, we would have to push through this large wall.
That's a really good way to put it. So it's sort of the right in terms of analyzing whether participants want to be long volatility, short volatility, how levels are likely to behave in terms of whether we're going to stick around there or whether they're going to accelerate us, stuff like that. I think the option profile can be very, very useful, but in order to just get a sort of a much cleaner picture, and just understand where the liquidity is, where the big levels are, how those levels are changing, whether volatility is making them expand or contract, what the market's overall convexity is. And what I mean by that is there more of opportunity to the upside or the downside in terms of pure options being held, regardless of who they're held by? That's what this chart can tell you. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, it's primarily concerned with levels, right? It's kind of similar to seeing a lot of absorption, whether it's, I'm talking about footprint again here, sorry, but if there's some large seller who's getting absorbed on the offer, or someone slamming the bid at some level, we just know that it's a large liquidity level, right? And there's ways of whether you're trying to take a short or you're trying to look for price action to move through that level. It's doesn't matter whether they were hitting the bid or the offer, and that's the same as for the gex.
I was like really hyped to see that some of our, beta testers, when they first used this, they hadn't even necessarily thought about that, like about the complexities involved in, what goes where, but they would just see the level pop up really big, and you see something like this, and you're like, okay, we're going to 43, 45. You don't have to
Yeah.
think about it. You just see the liquidity there. You're like, okay, cool. You know,
Yes.
where you see the liquidity getting, you see people getting out of these puts, which is what's happening right now, and because you can see those dots are on the outside and you can see that the dots are on the inside here, this strike is growing, and you have a really clear idea of, oh, that gives me a pretty clear directional bias. I have a very very solid target, right?
Yeah, the liquidity has an attraction to it, right? It's like pulling price towards it because that's where everyone's looking. It's reflexive in that sense.
And I think that that's something that, again, a little bit of a tangent, but that hasn't been understood well enough in the Gex world. It's that people are very concerned all the time with whether something is, cut like dealer side or paper side, customer side. But the reality is, like, the market is a whole organism. The question is, where is everybody positioned? How is the whole market positioned? And that's what we need to know in order to know what sorts of dynamics are going to occur. And
Yes.
so that's part of the reason that we did this the way that we did. Let me actually hop over into full because I personally love watching full, because you can
Really?
see. Yeah, actually, yeah.
Oh, I don't know.
I
I like
have.
Max the most. I feel like it's the most like honed down.
I mean, that's totally fair. I've just been watching this the last few days, more and
Mhm.
more, and I just been getting more into it. So the reason I like it is because here, as with Classic, we're looking at the next 3 months of expiries, and we're running our classification on all of that data, right?
Mhm.
And then it's all coming into here. And so I can see, for instance, on this sell-off, if you look at next, it looks like there aren't that many puts underneath us. And I like to see puts underneath us in order to know whether we're going to
Oh.
squeeze or not. But if you look at full, you can see, oh, wow, they actually have been adding underneath us, uh, because they've been adding in further out expiries. So there actually is a lot more juice under there to squeeze. And then you can see it contract over the course of the day. And then I can also
Um,
go even further up and see, oh, how far, where are they adding calls, right? And so it gives me an image that's not just of today, it's of how is everybody reacting in the next 3 months of expiries on the option chain because of what's happening today. Although actually there is a slight difference, right, in terms of how we're doing major and minor, or major
Hmm.
positive and major negative here, or is it the same?
No. So in this one, we're only doing majors, no zero. But the majors are calculated the same as in classic. So we're just looking at like max positive or max call convexity, max put convexity. Now the reason we're not doing zero gamma, so we're still doing the spline for this for finding those peaks, but we don't do zero gamma just because. Uh, so in classic, because we're doing that assumption, there's almost always, well, there's always that very clear gex curve. If you can think of like, drawing a line around the put gamma and the call gamma, there's this sort of like x cubed looking function. And so there's generally a nice zero crossover point, which is our zero gamma. Now for this, because the positions are rarely take that like easy curve. We don't have a good way of determining neutral, at least not yet. I think we're still going to look into that. But it gets kind of funky when we're trying to plot zero gamma on something like this.
Just kind of, I personally don't mind it because it essentially just reflects how much more dynamic the positioning is here. Uh,
Yes, exactly.
and I think that gets us pretty cleared up to move on. Maybe I should just let me
Hmm.
just show, obviously as you switch tickers, they have different types of option chains, and so you see different types of things. I do really like watching SPY on here as well sometimes, but as we'll get into in other videos, right, depending on the ticker that you're using, the dynamics are a little bit different. This is just about visualizing the data, classifying order flow, getting everything up there so that you have a really easy way of understanding and seeing it. But SPY, SPX, slightly different dynamics. Super interesting relationship though. In any case, yeah, let's move on to order flow.
Yeah. So now we have time-based charts. Um, or this is a way of looking at over the course of the entire day rather than just the current ladder, even with dots. This is a more clear way of looking the change of the option structure over time. And here we're essentially plotting across like the deltas, the gammas, something else called we call convexity, and looking at the change over time of how the positions are moving.
I know. I think that's a great primer. I'm going to move back over here to options profile, right? And we'll stay on SPX for the purposes of this, right? Because the idea here is we have this like very, very powerful order flow classification algorithm, and it's telling us what's coming in and what's going out all the time. But the problem is, right, when you're looking at this, as much work as we've done to put all the dots on here and have the history slider and all that stuff, and as easy as it is to see these really big positions, what happens if a massive order comes through and you're looking away from your screen, and so it takes you a little bit because you have to look back and see, oh, the 43, 45 has been shrinking over the last half hour or something like that, right? Like there's a difference between looking at the whole position, looking at the landscape, and actually identifying what's happening in order flow. Um, and that's what the order flow plots are for. So we're going to take all this stuff, all these orders that are coming in, and then we're going to weight them according to either their deltas or their gammas. So among other things, which I'll get into as well. So if you look at DEX order flow, for instance, what this is doing is it's saying um, we're making a very initial sort of crucial distinction between what we call bullish and bearish order flow. So bullish order flow means that either somebody bought calls or sold puts because those are both bullish, and bearish order flow means that it's the opposite. Either somebody bought puts or they sold calls. And then every time an order comes through, we're looking at the net delta of that order, and then we're graphing it. So bullish orders are represented by bars going up, and bearish orders are represented by bars going down. The cool thing is we can do the same thing for the gamma, which is how we get to our gex order flow. And gamma is a little bit different because with delta order flow, what happens is if there's an order, like let's say that somebody buys a ton of in the money calls, right, which are an 80 delta or something like that. A lot of times those are transactions that are made in order to hedge other things. Um, but it'll show up as a very, very big order on delta order flow because there's a lot of deltas there. Gex order flow prioritizes things that are at the money or near the money. So orders that are coming in to seek maximum convexity. In other words, like they're taking a very intense directional bet. And so we wanted to include both so that you can have your own way of adjudicating what is significant and what isn't. And comparing the two can also be particularly fruitful. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to note too is that so when we're looking at the ladder, right, and we're seeing the positions change, oftentimes, maybe we see some large strike grow or shrink, but oftentimes people are taking spreads, right? They're selling a put here, they're buying a call there. It's a combination of positions, and so with our subplots or our order flow plots, um, we're actually able to combine those. So rather than trying to look at the ladder and trying to piece together whether these positions are being opened in tandem, you can look at the order flow plots and be like, okay, well, the net deltas of this transaction occurring is actually this amount, rather than trying to put together strikes.
So then moving on to convexity order flow, that's something a little different, right? Um,
Yeah, this is something that we discussed quite a bit. What's the difference between gex and convexity, or what does convexity really mean? Um, Generally, and this is kind of tied into like the assumptions that are made about contract or options trading with gex. But gex is more of a directional, right? So like we're looking at calls and we're saying that they have positive gamma, or puts and that they have quote unquote negative gamma. But in actuality, gamma is totally it's not determined by contract type. If you buy a call or you buy a put, you're long gamma, or your position has positive gamma, right? It's not related to direction,
well,
and so
it's a bet on the expansion of volatility, right? It's you're saying something's crazy is going to happen, so I want to be holding on to something that's going to pay me a lot if it happens.
exactly. Yeah. So like Gex, there's a directionality baked into it, but with convexity, we're saying, okay, well, we just want to look at whether people are long or short volatility. And because I know that like selling calls and puts is a pretty common trade on SPX. And so convexity is saying, okay, well, people are looking for price to either stop trending or to continue trending, right? So if they're shorting convexity, they're saying, I don't expect price to continue trending in its direction, so I'm going to sell convexity or sell gamma there. Now, if I'm looking for a breakout, maybe I'm long convexity, and maybe I'm looking for a breakout that's so strong it doesn't even matter that I can be long a call and a put. So technically, I'm directionally unbiased, but I just need the position to move, or I need a spot to move enough so that my position will profit off that. And that's sort of the main distinction between convexity and gex.
And I think there's actually a really nice example here, coincidentally, right? Which is that, for instance, we were selling off, right? SPX came all the way down here. And if you look at DEX order flow, you see, oh, wow. I mean, there's a lot of disagreement here, it seems like. But in general, it looks like, well, there's a lot of bearish order flow here, which, kind of makes sense because price kept on coming down after that. But then if you take a minute and you look over here and you look at convexity order flow, you can tell that those were positions that were short volatility, right? Because the way that convexity order flow is calculated is we're basically taking, as you put it, long gamma goes up and short gamma goes down. So if they're buying options, then instead of having bullish bearish, if they're buying options, then you'll see these bars go up. And if they're selling options, you'll see these bars go down. And here it looks like they actually sold a lot of options. So this was actually a pretty major bet that, oh, volatility is going to start to subside. Um, and that's more or less what happened, right? We came down a little bit more, but that was more or less the end of the sell-off. And so this can be a very powerful indication in tandem with DEX and GEX order flow to start to understand how it is that people are getting positioned in a particular product at a given point in time. we can move on from here actually because it gets even more fancy, which is, for instance, let's actually start, I think, with the aggregated DEX because that to me is
Yeah.
the sort of simplest and potentially even the most powerful metric.
Aggregate DEX is probably the most familiar to people who look at these kinds of tools. We're essentially just looking at the cumulative state over the course of the day, whether people are generally bullish or bearish.
So in terms of like purely how it's calculated, like all we're doing, all this chart is if you take the top chart and you imagine just adding every bar up to the prior bar, whether positive or negative, then that just produces the lower chart. So it'll just tell us over the course of the day, did people buy or sell more um, essentially, share equivalent worth of options on that day. So you can tell that so far today, SPX has been going down and people have been shorting the market net more using options than getting long the market.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's a nice little sanity check, and also if you see very major divergences between aggregate DEX and spot price, that can be an indication that something strange is happening.
Yeah, I
So,
think
I
one
mean,
thing to note too is that, when we're looking at like the cumulative or aggregate DEX over the course of the day, we're looking at the change or the state, right? The cumulative state. You can almost think of it as, I think this is more clear with like net convexity or net gex, but it's almost like pressure, right? There's a measure of pressure of these positions that are occurring, and order flow can also be thought of as a release of that pressure. Maybe there's like a significant change in state, and then order flow is kind of marking those points at which our aggregate decks are pivoting or changing on a local basis.
yeah, and you can totally see it, right? Like for instance, we have this like really big order come through here, and aggregate DEX drops, right?
Mhm.
Meaning that somebody made a big transaction, they're shorting, and then we see spot continue to drop for a bit, um, and yeah, it's this one's pretty one to one.
Mhm.
The other guys are a little more complicated, so I'm gonna pull up uh, net gex over here, and this one's actually, I mean, I kind of love this one today, to be honest, because so all net gex is doing is and we call it netgex because it is netgex. If you go over to state, right, and then you take a look at next, um, and we'll make sure we're on SPX right here. If we were to take the gamma, right, the gamma exposure of everything right now, and clearly right now on SPX, it's significantly more call dominated than it was earlier in the day because of this one specific 43.45 strike. So if we move over into the order flow tab, and we look at netgex over here, you can see it's been climbing and climbing and climbing and climbing. And what that tells us is that there's more upside convexity than there is downside convexity in the option market at this time. So what we're doing is we're taking call gamma exposure and subtracting put gamma exposure, and we're taking the state of the entire chain. So that means that essentially we're looking at this picture, whatever that picture is, and then we're doing the math on call gamma exposure minus put gamma exposure. And so you can tell whether the market is, in terms of like pure, upside versus downside convexity, extended more in one direction or the other. So for instance, this really big shift right here, I don't know, do you see this, Jasper? Like at
Yeah,
around 2 p.m.
yeah. There's a big spike there.
Yeah, it's just we're in this like really clean trend where people are getting, they're essentially more puts are being bought, um, or opened, I should say. More puts are being opened, and then all of a sudden we get a big shift, and that comes prior to the actual bottom of the day. But it looks like at least today, in terms of pure convexity, the option market transitioned before spot, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, that change is marking people looking for that reversion, especially after such a quick sell-off like that, right? People are looking for that little bounce there.
Yeah, yeah, which is, either they sold a lot of puts or they got into a lot of calls. In this particular case, I know because of how NetGex works that this means that all of a sudden people started getting into a lot more calls.
Mhm.
Let's move on, and then I think we only have one left, which is net
Yeah.
convexity.
Yeah, so net convexity is similar to net gex in how we're calculating it, right? But as opposed to call versus puts, we're measuring the state of positions that are long gamma and subtracting positions that are short gamma, right? So, as people are looking for more convexity, as that builds over the day, we can see that. Or if they're looking for less convexity, a little more simply put, increasing convexity is people looking for that vol expansion. And as we're coming to a level, or people are measuring certain things, they're expecting less volatility or volatility to revert. Convexity typically will see it drop down.
Yeah, and the math behind it, and I love that explanation. The math behind it is really just taking the gamma exposure of long options and subtracting the gamma exposure of short options. And so you can actually see that transition here, which is really cool. Even before the sell-off, we're actually right at the beginning, net convexity starts to build until all of a sudden on SPX, net, we actually have positive overall convexity exposure, meaning that option holders were expecting more volatility. We get a lot of it. We remain positive up until this point, and this is where option sellers start to step in and they start to sell more options, right? And just barely, but we're still sort of zero. And then here, right, almost at 2 p.m. is when people really start to sell more options, and we get this like big transition. So when a lot of options are being sold, right? When we're at a level that is all the way down here, like this is quite substantially risk off. It means that we're expecting volatility to contract for the rest of the day. But again, right, like that only really started happening, like let's say whenever we broke this level, which is sort of our like baseline option selling level for the day, it looks like that only really started to happen around 2 p.m., which is around here, right?
Yes. Exactly.
So, I mean, we were really lucky to get such a clear example today, but it's pretty amazing just to see how um, like the way that traders' expectations of volatility directly translate right into whether they're buying or selling options. And from I mean, my background is more so as an option trader, and this is something that I really wanted to have because I want to know, is it okay for me to be holding on to short short strangles here or not, right? Like what's going on? What do
Yeah.
other people think?
Yeah, it's a really great bird's eye view of like what everyone's trying to pile into, what they're expecting, you know, how they're reacting to price, following their expectations or not. And yeah.
Yeah, super cool. And again, for all these things, obviously that we can switch between tickers, and you'll get different perspectives because different traders trade different tickers, and there's like there can be you know it's also part of just getting to know your particular underlying and how it trades, right? Everything has its own character, and
Yeah.
hopefully these tools are a good way to get to know that character. Man, well, that's a lot of stuff, Jess.
It is. I think we covered everything actually.
I think that was everything. I should mention, right? Like we have resources page with actual documentation, all the formulas, everything, um, um, and some pictures as well. And yeah, I mean we're around to answer questions, and we hope that as many of you guys as possible learn to use these things and figure out to use them in ways that we haven't even anticipated. I mean, that would be absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, thank you guys. Hope you guys have a good one. Good luck with all your trading. I hope our tools help you guys with that too.